After working to the body's limit, she entered a car thinking it was her only chance of rest, without imagining that that mistake would completely change the course of her life. On the other side, a man accustomed to luxury and the coldness of business encounters, a scene that shakes something he didn't even know still existed inside him. Between exhaustion, unexpected kindness, and two opposite worlds, an unlikely connection is born that challenges everything both believed about their own realities. But when feelings begin to emerge, they will have to face deep fears, social differences, and the most difficult doubt of all. Is this real or just a passing moment? Before discovering how this unexpected encounter can transform two lives forever, leave your like and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. The second shift had ended almost an hour ago, but Claudia Mendez was still in the fourth-floor corridor of Hospital Renassa, finishing the notes on the medical record for bed 18. Her feet ached in a way she could no longer ignore, a burning sensation that climbed up her ankle and reached her calf, as if her tendons were protesting against every step taken in the last 16 hours. The white uniform had an antiseptic stain on the right sleeve, and something else she preferred not to identify at knee height. Her hair tied in a bun, which had started the shift impeccable, now hung to the left side, with loose strands stuck to her forehead by the afternoon sweat. She closed the medical record, returned the clipboard to the nursing station, exchanged a tired wave with her night shift colleague, and grabbed the worn blue backpack that sat under the counter. Inside it, besides the basics, there was an empty lunchbox that had not been opened during the shift because there had been no time. Her stomach had growled discreetly at 2 in the afternoon, and she simply ignored it, the same way she ignored many other things the body asked for and the work did not allow. Outside the hospital, the São Paulo night was humid, in that specific way that precedes rain without ever actually becoming real rain. The air smelled of wet asphalt and the smoke from the buses passing on the avenue. Claudia stopped on the sidewalk for a second, took a deep breath and felt her legs go weak. It was almost 12:30. The hospital was in Itaim Bibi, a neighborhood that at this hour still circulated with sophisticated cars and restaurant lights, but which for her represented only the starting point of a 1-hour commute to the apartment in Tatuapé, where she shared 2 rooms with her cousin. The cell phone battery was at 15%. She opened the transport app and saw that the wait for the next bus was 40 minutes. The subway had already closed. An app ride would cost 22 reais, an amount she didn't have in her available balance until the following week's deposit. She closed the app, put her phone in her pocket, and started walking toward the side street, where Gerson, the afternoon shift stretcher bearer, used to park his old car, and sometimes dropped her off on the way since he passed near the terminal. Gerson had warned in the message group that he would leave earlier that night, but the message arrived while she was still wearing gloves and a gown, and she hadn't read it in time. She only remembered this when she turned the corner and saw the spot where he usually parked completely empty. She stood still for a moment, looking at the space as if the car could materialize out of nowhere, and then realized, with cold clarity, how exhausted she was. It wasn't just the normal tiredness of a long shift. It was something deeper, starting behind the eyes, going down the neck, and settling in the shoulders with the weight of a huge stone. She continued down the side street, passing a private parking lot with a guardhouse and cameras, and then a line of vehicles stopped along the curb. It was a quiet, well-lit street, frequented by high-value cars, the types of vehicles parked in front of restaurants whose menus she had never consulted. There was a dark sedan with tinted windows, engine off, the rear door slightly ajar, as if the last occupant had stepped out in a hurry and forgotten to pull it all the way shut. In the state she was in, with heavy eyes and a mind functioning in the automatic mode that exhaustion imposes, the open door seemed like a familiar invitation. Gerson had a dark car. Gerson always left the door unlocked for her to enter when she arrived after him. The reasoning was not conscious. It was just the reflex of someone who had no more energy to think, the kind of association the brain makes when it is operating at the limit. Claudia pulled the door, threw her backpack on the seat, settled into the cold dark leather and closed her eyes with a sigh. The smell was different. She registered this somewhere in her consciousness without giving it importance. It was more sophisticated, heavier, a perfume of an expensive and discreet interior that had nothing to do with the cheap air conditioning of Gerson's Goal. The seat was soft in a way Gerson's seat never was, with that type of padding that molds slightly to the body. But her feet stopped hurting when she stretched her legs, and that relief was enough to erase any warning signs that still remained. In less than 2 minutes, Claudia's breathing became slow, deep, regular. She slept. It wasn't a light sleep. It was the type of sleep the body claims after being neglected for too long, the type that erases everything and asks for no permission nor offers any warning. She did not hear the footsteps that approached along the sidewalk a few minutes later. She did not hear the driver's door open with the precise and sophisticated click of a high-end vehicle. She did not feel the slight sway of the car when someone entered and stood still, in silence, looking at the back seat through the rearview mirror with an expression that mixed surprise, irritation, and then something different, something that he himself would take time to name. She slept with her head tilted toward her right shoulder, feet crossed on the leather mat, backpack clutched against her chest as if it were the only possession she needed to protect in the world. Outside, before entering, the owner of the car had stood motionless for a moment, looking through the window at the sleeping figure in the back seat. His suit jacket was over his arm. The dinner had been long and useless, and now there was a woman in uniform sleeping in his car, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Edoardo Cavalcanti looked at her for a few more seconds. There was something in the way she slept that stopped him, a total surrender to sleep that seemed less like rest and more like a capitulation. People who had just finished a meal at an expensive restaurant did not sleep like that. People who were simply tired from a party or a corporate event did not sleep like that. There was something in that sleep that he recognized vaguely, without being able to name it immediately, but which made him pull his hand away from her shoulder even before touching her. Then he noticed the uniform. White with the Hospital Renassa logo embroidered on the left side of the chest, the same institution where his partner had undergone a heart procedure the previous month. A nursing technician. The badge was face down, and he couldn't read the name, but the uniform told enough. After an entire shift, maybe 2, she had entered the wrong car without even noticing. Edoardo remained still for another moment in the driver's seat, his jacket still over his legs, the car off. Outside, São Paulo continued its midnight rhythm. A taxi passing by, the distant laughter of someone leaving a restaurant, the constant and irrelevant noise of a city that never stops completely. Inside the car, there was only the slow breathing of a woman whom the world had exhausted to the point of making her sleep in the wrong place. He could wake her now. It was the obvious thing to do, but he looked at her once more at the feet she had unconsciously stretched out on the leather mat, as if that were the first comfortable space she had found in hours, and decided not to do it. He took the jacket, passed it slowly through the space between the 2 front seats, and covered her carefully, without touching her at any moment. Then he returned to the driver's seat, leaned the backrest slightly, and remained in silence, looking through the window at the lit street. It wasn't a grand decision. It was just the decision not to be one more person who woke someone who had reached their limit. Edoardo Cavalcanti was not a man given to impulsive gestures. At 42 years old, he had built a solid reputation in the supplementary health sector exactly for that, for the calculated coldness with which he evaluated situations and made decisions that others hesitated to make. He was the majority partner of Cavalcanti Saúde, a medical plan operator with a portfolio of more than 300,000 beneficiaries spread across the interior of São Paulo and the capital. He had offices on Faria Lima, a penthouse in Moema, and a smaller apartment in Lisbon that he used on average 3 weeks a year. The people who worked for him described him as fair, demanding, and difficult to impress. For that very reason, the fact that he was sitting in the driver's seat of his own car at almost 1 in the morning, while a stranger slept in the back seat covered by his imported linen jacket, was something he himself would have difficulty explaining if anyone asked. The dinner had been with Renato Figueiredo, an investor who had been signaling interest in a minority stake in the operator for 3 months. 3 months of meetings, spreadsheets sent, calls and counter-proposals, and that night should have been the closing. It wasn't. Renato had arrived at the restaurant differently, disinterested, answering messages on his cell phone during much of the conversation, and at coffee he had said vaguely that he needed more time to review the numbers. Eduardo recognized the pattern. Renato had found a better opportunity elsewhere and didn't have the clarity to say it directly. The negotiation had died that night without anyone declaring it over, and that was the worst kind of ending possible. He had left the restaurant with the arid feeling of someone who invests time in something that reveals itself to be empty in the end. It was a feeling he knew well, and not just in business. In the back seat, the woman moved slightly in her sleep, adjusting the position of her head without waking up. The jacket slid a little, and she, in an unconscious movement, pulled it back with her hand, clutching it against her chest. Eduardo observed this through the rearview mirror without moving. There was something in that gesture, in that way of holding what covered her as if she needed to protect her own heat, that made him think of the word he had tried to name earlier without succeeding. Exhaustion. Not the kind that is resolved with a good night's sleep. The kind that accumulates over months, perhaps years, and that settles in the body in a way that sleep alone does not entirely undo. He had seen that exhaustion on his father's face in the last years before he retired from the small neighborhood pharmacy that had supported the family for decades, and he had recognized it on his own face on a Sunday morning 2 years ago when he looked in the mirror and realized he couldn't remember the last time he had truly rested. The cell phone vibrated in the storage compartment. It was Rodrigo, his personal assistant, sending the summary of the meeting with the legal department scheduled for the next day at 8. Eduardo looked at the message for a few seconds without responding, then put the phone down with the screen facing down. Outside, a couple was leaving a Japanese restaurant on the corner, laughing at something. The city continued its indifferent movement. Eduardo looked through the glass at the street and thought, for the first time in a long time, that there was something deeply strange about spending an entire life building things that never seemed to be enough. The woman in the back seat slept for 2 more hours. At 3:20 in the morning, she woke up all at once, without transition, with a startle that made her sit up abruptly and lightly hit her head on the window glass. For a fraction of a second, her eyes swept the interior of the car without registering anything they recognized. The beige leather, the dark finishes, the discreet and sophisticated dashboard that had nothing to do with Gerson's yellowish goal. Then her gaze found the rearview mirror, and in the mirror there were 2 dark eyes observing her with a calmness she was not prepared to find. She screamed. It was a short scream, a pure reflex of someone waking up in the wrong place, but enough to make Eduardo lean his torso slightly to the right in the shock. He raised his hands in a sort of pacifying gesture, even before speaking. "Calm down," he said. "You're fine. Nothing happened." Claudia stayed with her back pressed against the door, eyes wide, backpack pressed against her chest, with a force that would leave marks on her fingers. Her heart was beating loud enough for her to hear. It took a few seconds for the scene to organize in her mind. The jacket over her legs, the car stopped, the man in the front seat who hadn't turned around completely, only spoken with the low and direct voice of someone trying not to scare her more than he already had. "Where am I?" she asked, and her own voice came out hoarse from sleep. "In the same place where you entered," he said. "You slept. I thought it was better not to wake you." She looked out the window. The street was emptier than before, but recognizable. Hospital Renassa was still visible in the background, with the ground floor lights on. She had slept less than 200 meters from where she had boarded. "I got into the wrong car," she said, and it wasn't a question. "You got into the wrong car," he confirmed, with the same neutrality. There was a silence. Claudia opened her mouth to speak, closed it, opened it again. The apologies got tangled in her throat without finding the right sequence, because what she was feeling was not just shame. It was the concrete dread of a worker who understands that certain mistakes have consequences that go far beyond the embarrassment of a moment. She knew men like the owner of that car. She had attended to many of them in the hospital's private rooms. She knew that some reacted to inconveniences with lawsuits, with calls to supervisors, with that specific way of exercising power that doesn't need to scream to hurt. "I know there is no explanation," she finally said. "I confused it with a colleague's car. I can call the hospital administration right now if you want to report something. I understand if you want to do that. Eduardo looked at her through the mirror for a moment. I don't want to report anything, he said. I want to know if you have a way to get home. Claudia did not respond immediately. The question was too simple for the size of the situation, and that disarmed her in a way she hadn't predicted. She was prepared to defend herself, to apologize with the degree of formality her position required before someone like him. She was not prepared for his first concern to be about her commute home. There are buses, she said, and it sounded like the most inadequate answer possible for that moment. At this hour, he said, without judgment. It was just a statement. She looked at her phone. 2% battery. The next bus, if there were still any on the line, would take at least 30 minutes. She would have to stand on the sidewalk, on that street, with her phone dying in her pocket. Eduardo turned the car on. He didn't ask if she wanted a ride. He didn't wait for her to ask. He just turned the key in the ignition, turned on the heater with a careful adjustment and said, "Tell me where you live." Claudia stared at the back of the seat in front of her for 2 full seconds before answering. Then she gave the address in Tatuapé in a low voice, as if reducing the volume could also reduce how much that situation had gone beyond anything she could control. The car glided down the street in silence and entered the wide avenue that would lead to the eastern corridor, and she remained with her backpack on her lap, fingers coiled around the strap, looking through the window at the passing city. In the next 3 days, Claudia didn't think much about the subject, or she tried not to think. She had the functional habit of filing away things she didn't know where to put, pushing them to a corner of her memory where they stayed quiet while there was work to be done, and there was always work to be done. On Wednesday, she covered the afternoon shift of a colleague who had called in sick. On Thursday, she arrived an hour early because the supervisor had asked for help with the following week's schedule, which had 3 holes after a technician left. On Friday, she did both shifts again because the extra went into the month's pay, and the month's pay had certain destinations even before hitting the account. Even so, in the short breaks, in the moments when she sat in the corridor to eat something standing up or while waiting for the elevator, the memory of the car returned. Not as something dramatic. It returned in the details. The smell of the interior, the softness of the seat, the jacket that had been placed over her with a care no one had asked for, and the question, simple and direct, without the condescension she had expected. "I want to know if you have a way to get home." She had arrived home that morning without saying much. Her cousin Veronica was already sleeping. Claudia had taken a shower, laid down on the narrow bed in the room she shared with her, and stayed looking at the ceiling for almost half an hour before being able to sleep again. Nothing had actually happened. An absurd misunderstanding, an unexpected kindness, the end. That was the correct script for that story, and she knew it. That's why I found it strange when, on Friday afternoon, the 4th-floor receptionist appeared in the corridor with a small package and said it had arrived for her at the entrance counter. She wasn't expecting anything. She hadn't ordered anything. The package was rectangular, wrapped in dark craft paper without a bow, with a card glued to the front. Her name was written by hand, Claudia, just the first name, with a firm calligraphy and no flourishes. She stood looking at the package for a while, holding it like someone holding something that could be a trap, and then she opened the card. It was written, "Your feet deserve something better than what they were wearing. Sorry for the intrusion. E.C." Inside the wrapping was a shoebox. Inside the box was a pair of professional nursing sneakers, the type with orthopedic soles and breathable material, exactly the model that orthopedists recommend for professionals who stay on their feet for long shifts. The size was correct. She looked at the size and then at her own feet, wearing old sneakers with internally worn soles, and felt a shiver that wasn't cold. He had looked at her feet that night, he had seen, and he had remembered. Claudia stayed in the corridor for longer than would be reasonable, holding the box. The receptionist had already returned to the counter. 2 colleagues passed by, without noticing anything different. She put the sneakers back in the box, closed the wrapping carefully, put everything inside her backpack, and went back to the nursing station without commenting on anything to anyone. That afternoon, she worked with her old shoes. But that night in the apartment, she opened the box again. She took out one of the sneakers and stayed holding it for a while, examining the firm sole, the insole with arch support, the lightweight material. It was a truly good shoe, the type she had looked at on health equipment websites, and closed the tab without putting it in the cart because it wasn't the right time. It cost the equivalent of almost 2 days of work at her current salary. Veronica appeared at the bedroom door with a cup of tea and saw her cousin's expression. "Who sent that?" she asked. "No one," said Claudia, and the answer was so obviously false that her cousin simply sat on the bed beside her and waited. Claudia told her, not everything but enough. The wrong car, the man, the silent ride, and now this. While she spoke, she tried to assemble the narrative in a way that made sense, that had the logical sequence of cause and effect that would make the gesture understandable, but every time she got back to the sneakers she was stuck, because there was no simple logic for it. It was too big to be mere courtesy, and too small to be declared interest. It stayed in an intermediate space where she didn't quite know what to do. Veronica drank her tea and said, "Are you going to return them?" Claudia looked at the sneaker in her hand. "I don't know," she said. And that answer, coming from a woman who saw the world in black and white as a matter of survival, was more revealing than anything else she could have said. The next morning, she went to work with the new sneakers. The difference was immediate and disproportionate. Already in the first shift, she noticed that her legs hurt less, that the ankle that had swollen discreetly and chronically in recent months was firmer, that she reached the end of the shift without that burning in the sole of the foot that she had normalized without realizing it. During the lunch break, she sat on the corridor bench with a strange feeling, a mix of gratitude and discomfort, the type of feeling that appears when someone does something for you that you hadn't even been able to do for yourself. There was a cell phone number on the card. She took the card out of her backpack and stayed looking at it for some time, with her lunch cooling beside her. Then she folded the card carefully, put it back in the internal pocket of the backpack, and ate her lunch, looking at the corridor window that overlooked the hospital parking lot. She didn't send a message that day. But the next morning, while waiting for the bus at the stop with her feet comfortable inside the new sneakers and her phone in hand, she opened the card again, typed the number, and wrote only, "Thank you. The shoes make a difference. I shouldn't have accepted, but I did. Claudia." She sent it before she could convince herself not to. The response took 40 minutes, which was exactly the time it took for her to arrive at the hospital, go through the turnstile, change clothes, and check the day's schedule. When the phone vibrated in her apron pocket, she was standing with her back to the station window, preparing a tray. She read the message standing up, without moving for a few seconds. It was written, "I'm glad they make a difference. Did you work 2 shifts in a row that night?" She stared at the question for a moment. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and returned to the tray. But she responded, and that changed something. In the days that followed, the messages were sparse but regular. Eduardo did not write with frequency or urgency. He wrote in the rhythm of someone who has much to do but reserves a deliberate moment, like someone setting aside a small portion of attention with the awareness that they are doing so. He asked simple things: if she had managed to rest, if the shift had been heavy, if she had eaten something real during the break. She responded with the restraint of someone who doesn't yet know what the territory is, aware that the line between kindness and something more complicated could be thin, especially when the differences between the two worlds were as evident as they were between hers and his. She had researched his name. It was inevitable. Eduardo Cavalcanti appeared in 2 or 3 business magazine articles, in a profile of a health sector publication, and on the institutional page of Cavalcanti Saúde, where he was listed as founding partner and CEO. The photo on the site showed a man in a suit in front of a corporate panel, with the controlled expression of someone who learned to pose for cameras without revealing much. It was the same man who had placed a jacket over her while she slept on a leather seat that cost more than a month of her salary. Claudia closed the browser and went to wash the dishes, but she continued responding to the messages. And at some point in the second week, without either of them declaring or planning it, the short questions gave way to longer conversations, which moved from one subject to another with a naturalness she herself had not expected to find with someone like him. The first meeting outside the car happened on his initiative, 3 weeks after the night in the parking lot, and it was so deliberately casual that Claudia spent 2 days thinking about whether it had been planned or not. He had sent a message on a Wednesday morning saying he needed to pass near Hospital Renassa at lunchtime for a meeting in a building on the avenue and asking if she would have time for a quick coffee. She had stayed looking at the message long enough to miss her turn at the cafeteria microwave and then replied that yes, she would have about 20 minutes during the noon break. He appeared punctually. He was in a suit without a tie, the type of combination that signaled a morning full of meetings, but a lunch he had decided to control. He brought 2 coffees on a paper tray from a good coffee shop on the side street and waited for her on the sidewalk in front of the hospital without entering, which she interpreted as a consideration she hadn't asked for, but which she noticed. They stood by a park bench nearby, drinking coffee amidst the noise of the avenue's lunch hour, and the conversation was different from the messages, less filtered, more direct, with the real pauses that written words hide. He asked about the work without the superficiality with which people usually ask about work, that kind of generic interest that expects an equally generic answer. He wanted to know specifically what 2 shifts in a row were like in practice, what it cost the body and the head, how much time there was to recover before the next one. She answered with honesty, because there was something in the way he asked that made euphemism unnecessary. She said the second shift was always the hardest, because the body still held the memory of the first, that the tiredness of the end of the day accumulated over the tiredness of the morning like layers, and that there were weeks when she arrived home and couldn't remember details of the way because the autopilot had taken over so completely that conscious memory simply hadn't registered it. He listened without interrupting, without offering solutions before she finished, without making the expression of someone waiting for the opening to talk about themselves. When she finished, he was silent for a second and said, "How long have you been doing this?" 4 years, she said. He processed this with a nod that wasn't agreement, it was recognition. And then he said something she hadn't expected. "I've been managing a health plan operator for 15 years, and honestly, I don't know if I've ever really thought about what it's like to be on the other side." She looked at him, trying to identify if there was condescension in that. There wasn't. There was something more uncomfortable. Honesty. The 20 minutes turned into 35. She returned to the hospital 6 minutes late, entered through the side door and past the supervisor in the corridor with a wave she hoped was neutral enough not to generate questions. The supervisor looked at her with a slightly evaluative expression, but said nothing. In the following days, Claudia became more careful, not with the messages which continued, but with what she allowed herself to feel from them. There was a huge difference between the 2 worlds that was more than financial. It was about rhythm, about expectation, about how one saw the future. She had learned early on that surviving in a city like São Paulo required cutting from the imagination everything that didn't fit the budget, not because the person was incapable of imagining, but because imagining impossible things was a luxury that cost energy that was better applied elsewhere. Eduardo Cavalcanti was not impossible in the way television actors are impossible. He was impossible in the way things that exist in the same world as you are impossible, that you can touch, but that belong to a logic of life that is not yours. And she had spent enough time in the hospital's private rooms, listening to conversations between wealthy patients and their visitors, to know that the distance between one world and another was more than money. It was an entire grammar of daily life that she was still learning to understand. Even so, when he sent a message on Friday saying he had sent a meal to her at the hospital, she didn't send it back. She ate the bento box from an Itaian Japanese restaurant she had never entered, sitting on the 4th-floor corridor bench with the discreet noise of the hospital around her, and stayed looking at the packaging as if it were a piece of evidence in a case she hadn't yet managed to close. Veronica said she had the face of someone who was falling in love. Claudia said she was getting the face of someone who was tired. Veronica said the 2 were not mutually exclusive. Claudia was silent for a while and then said, "He has a whole world that I don't know." And Veronica, who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Claudia, who had studied at the same state school, who worked as an administrative assistant in a logistics company, and had her own careful calculations about what was possible and what was not, said, "Everyone has a world that the other doesn't know. The question is, if he lets you into his." Claudia kept that. The second meeting happened the following Saturday, and this time it wasn't casual. Eduardo asked directly if she would be free that morning, that there was a place in Ibirapuera Park he wanted to show her. It wasn't an invitation to dinner at a restaurant where she would feel out of place. It was a park. She had known Ibirapuera since she was a child, had gone there countless times with her mother when she was little, and there was a care in that which she recognized. They walked through the park for almost 2 hours, with the morning sun still soft. He spoke of the company in a different way than one speaks in interviews or meetings, without the polished version, with the frustrations that were underneath. He said he had founded the operator with the idea of doing something different in the sector, and that for years he had wondered if he had succeeded or if he had just replicated the same problems with a better standard of finish. And she, walking beside him in a park she had visited for the first time on a Sunday afternoon with the mother she had lost 6 years ago, allowed her guard to drop a little. Just a little. Enough to say that she also had had a dream she had left for later, and that the later had lasted 4 years and still hadn't arrived. He asked what the dream was. She said, "Nursing. The full degree, not just the technical one." But the time and money never matched. He said nothing for a few steps. Then he said, "It matches, sometimes. You stop believing before checking." She didn't answer, but she walked a bit more beside him and didn't quicken her pace to create distance. When they returned to the park gate, the sun was already higher and the walking track had become busier. Claudia stopped at a stand to buy a water, and Eduardo paid for it before she opened her purse, in a gesture so natural she couldn't turn it into an issue. They stood for a moment at the gate with the city restarting around them, and there was a different quality to the silence between the two, less uncertain than it had been the first time, more honest. She said she needed to go. He nodded and said he also had a commitment in the afternoon. There was nothing dramatic in the goodbye, but when she boarded the bus that would take her back to Tatuapé, she looked through the window at the sidewalk without looking for him, and noticed she was smiling for no specific reason, the kind of smile that appears before the person realizes it was coming. She kept that too, carefully, in a protected place. Like someone keeping something they don't yet know how to name but already know is fragile. The complication had a name, Isabella Vasconcelos, and it arrived the way complications usually arrive, unannounced but inevitable, as if it had waited patiently for the right moment to appear. Claudia saw her for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon, when Eduardo stopped by the hospital to drop off a book he had mentioned in a conversation, a title about the healthcare system in Brazil that she had said she wanted to read. He appeared at the 4th-floor reception desk, handed the book to the receptionist to pass to her, and while Claudia looked through the corridor window at the parking lot below, she saw him leaving through the hospital's main gate toward a car that wasn't the dark sedan. It was a silver SUV, and outside the SUV was a woman with well-kept dark hair, beige dress pants, and a cream-colored silk blouse, the type of clothing that doesn't need jewelry to look expensive, because the manufacturing itself communicates the price. The woman said something, Eduardo replied, and there was a second in which she touched his arm with the familiarity of someone who has or once had the right to do so. Claudia moved away from the window and went back to the corridor. She didn't ask anything. It wasn't her place to ask. They hadn't agreed on anything, hadn't declared anything, and she had been careful exactly not to create expectations she herself wouldn't know how to manage. But that afternoon, she did the entire shift with doubled attention to every mechanical gesture, as if keeping her hands busy were enough not to think. She found out who Isabella was 2 days later, through a source she hadn't sought. Veronica had entered the Cavalcanti Saúde profile on a corporate social network, as Veronica inevitably would, and found in 2 clicks the name of the company's commercial director, Isabella Vasconcelos, business relationship, longtime partner of the company. She appeared at 3 company events in the institutional photos, beautiful, competent by what was read in the publications, and evidently an integral part of a world to which Claudia did not belong. Veronica presented the information with the expression of someone who doesn't know if they are helping or harming. Claudia said, "I don't know what she is to him." Veronica said, "But you want to know." And that was the issue, because if she wanted to know, it was because she had cared more than she had planned. And if she had cared more than she had planned, then she had lowered a guard she had raised for concrete reasons and not for abstract fear. She went to the next meeting anyway. It was 3 weeks after the park, a lunch at a simple restaurant he had chosen near Tatuape, in a choice she interpreted as conscious. She was quieter than in the other meetings, and he noticed. He didn't pretend not to notice. In the middle of lunch, he said, "There's something different today." She considered denying it, which would be easy and efficient and would solve nothing. Then she said, "I saw you with someone in the hospital parking lot." He was silent for a second, then said, "Isabella." She waited. He said, "We were married for 6 years. We separated 4 years ago. She is still part of the company's board because we built this together, and it would be unfair and wrong to ask her to leave. But that's all." Claudia looked at her plate for a moment. Then she said, "You should have told me before." He said, "Yes, I should have." There was no defense in that. It was a direct admission, and she recognized it because she was used to recognizing when someone was honest and when they were just managing a situation. The difference was in the eyes, in a specific quality of attention that the face couldn't completely fake. But she didn't resolve the matter at that lunch. She took the bus back home with more things to think about than she had brought. The information about Isabella didn't push her away from Eduardo in the simple way she had expected it would. There was something more complicated happening, which was the fact that she had reached a point where pushing away was a decision that cost, and it cost because there was something real being built brick by brick, conversation by conversation in those weeks. The crisis came from another side, as crises usually do when one is looking at the wrong place. The supervisor called Claudia to her office on a Thursday morning and said, with the careful expression of someone who doesn't want to cause more damage than necessary, that the hospital had undergone a restructuring in the 4th floor technical staff. The workload had been redistributed, 2 positions had been consolidated, and Claudia's schedule would be reduced by 2 weekly shifts starting the following month. The salary would drop proportionally. Claudia left the room with her mental calculator already working. 2 fewer shifts per week, multiplied by the weeks of the month, subtracted from the rent, the electricity bill, the installment for the technical course that still had payments, the half of the groceries she shared with Veronica. The result didn't close. She spent the rest of the shift working with the care and competence she had always applied to everything, because the work was the work regardless of what happened around it. But inside there was a dull murmur of concern she already knew well, the kind that appears when the numbers don't close and there is no margin for error. That night, on the bus back home, Eduardo sent a message asking if she had managed to read the first pages of the book. She stared at the message for a while, with the full and noisy bus around her, and then wrote, "I haven't had time yet. The day was difficult." He replied, "Do you want to talk about it?" She stared at the question for so long that the bus passed her stop, and she had to get off 2 stops later and walk back. She didn't answer that night. But in the early morning, when the apartment was quiet and Veronica was sleeping and the bedroom ceiling had that quality of silence that makes the mind work too much, she picked up her phone and wrote, "I was notified today that I will lose 2 shifts starting next month. I don't know yet how I will resolve it." She sent it, turned off the light, waited without knowing what she was waiting for. The response arrived at 6:15 in the morning, while she was still lying down. "You don't need to resolve this alone, we can talk." She stared at the sentence for a long time, with her heart beating at a tempo she hadn't authorized, and felt the exact weight of a decision that hadn't yet been made, but was already waiting for her. There was something Claudia rarely did, and that the exhaustion of years had trained in her as a protection mechanism. She didn't ask for help, not in the vulnerable way, not in the way that exposes how difficult things are before you are sure that the ground on the other side is firm. She had learned this in the most concrete way possible when, at 23, she had asked for help from someone she thought would provide support and who had used her vulnerability as currency, making her feel that every gesture of generosity was a debt that would need to be paid back in some way. Eduardo hadn't done that once. But the memory of the past doesn't consult the logic of the present when it acts. It simply acts. That's why she stayed quiet that morning, with the phone in her hand and the message on the screen, taking a deep breath in a sort of silent negotiation with herself. And then she wrote back, "It's okay. I'll find a way. But thank you." She put the phone away and got up to make breakfast. But the way she was going to find had been mentioned, and Eduardo had read it, and that also changed something without her being able to control it. Eduardo took 3 days to act, which Claudia interpreted as respect for the space she had marked with the "it's okay" she had sent that morning. He didn't insist, didn't send unsolicited suggestions, didn't send a second message trying to reopen the subject. He just waited, and that wait had a specific weight, she noticed, because she was used to the opposite. To men who didn't wait, who advanced over what you had said, as if your words were just the preliminary version of something they thought you really wanted to say. On Wednesday, he wrote, "There is someone I would like you to meet. She handles candidate selection for health scholarships at a foundation partnered with the company. No commitment at all. Just a conversation if you want." Claudia read the message during her shift break, sitting on the corridor bench with a carton of juice. She looked at it for a considerable time. There was something in that gesture that she needed to examine carefully before responding, because there were 2 ways to receive an offer like that, and both ways were honest at the same time. The first way was that of reasonable distrust. He owned a health plan operator, had contacts in foundations and institutions, and was using this network to solve a problem of hers in a way that made her indebted to a generosity that was too big. The second way was simpler and therefore harder to accept. He had heard what she had said in the park about the dream of a degree, had kept it, and had done something concrete with it, because he was the type of person who translated attention into action. She took a day to respond. She said, "All right, I can talk to her." The meeting happened on a Friday afternoon, in a small meeting room at the office of the Fundação Horizonte Saúde, located in a discreet building in Vila Clementino. The woman who received her was named Dr. Patricia Leão. She was about 50 years old, had short-cut grey hair, and a direct way of speaking that Claudia immediately recognized as that of someone who had spent a lot of time evaluating resumes and people, and had developed a healthy impatience with beating around the bush. Eduardo didn't go. He had made it clear that he wouldn't be part of the meeting, that he had only made the introduction, and Claudia was grateful for that in a way she didn't need to verbalize. Patricia listened to Claudia's professional history with genuine attention, asking specific questions, taking notes in her pad without any air of judgment. 4 years as a nursing technician, specialization in high-complexity care, semi-annual evaluation above average in the last 3 cycles, with no incidents recorded. She asked why Claudia hadn't tried the degree before. Claudia told the truth, time and money, and then she added something she hadn't planned to say. "And because I learned not to start what I'm not sure I can finish." Patricia looked at her for a second without writing anything. Then she said, "That is a survival skill, not a limitation. But sometimes it creates an artificial obstacle for things that would be possible with the right support." She presented 3 types of scholarships available for the next academic semester. One of them, aimed at professionals already working in the health field without a degree, covered 80% of the tuition at 2 partner institutions of the foundation, one of them with an evening course. The remainder could be supplemented by a financing program with a 2-year grace period and below-market interest rates. Claudia left the meeting with 2 brochures, a notebook Patricia had insisted she take, and a feeling in her chest she kept trying to identify on the bus back home. It wasn't euphoria. It was quieter than that, denser, the type of feeling that appears when something you had kept as impossible begins to show that maybe it isn't. She sent a message to Eduardo when she got home. "Dr. Patricia was incredible. There's a scholarship that might work. Thank you for making the introduction." He replied in minutes, "I'm happy. You deserve to know it existed." She stared at that sentence. You deserve to know it existed. Not, you deserve to have it. Not, I resolved it for you. Just, You deserve to know it existed. There was a huge difference between the three ways of saying the same thing, and he had chosen the only one that didn't take away from her the authorship of her own decision. That night, she told Veronica everything, sitting in the apartment's small kitchen with tea and biscuits, with the noise of the street coming through the half-open window. Veronica heard everything and then was silent for a moment and said, "He really likes you." Claudia said, "Maybe, but there's a lot between one world and another." Veronica said, "There is, and he's here anyway." Claudia didn't sleep well that night, but it wasn't from worry. It was from that type of insomnia that appears when the mind is processing something too big to fit into a single day, rearranging pieces in an order that the morning would need to confirm. She had spent 4 years surviving in a city that doesn't make it easy for those who start without a network, without inheritance, without the type of social capital that opens doors before you need to knock on them. And she had become good at it, at survival, in a way that filled her with pride and at the same time with a fatigue she rarely admitted, because admitting it would be like letting go of a stone she had carried for so long that her hands no longer knew what it was like to be empty. But there was something different happening now, an opening she hadn't asked for, and that had arrived anyway, and the question that kept her awake wasn't whether she should take advantage of it. It was whether she could, after so much time, trust that the ground on the other side was firm before taking the step. Eduardo had said in the park, "You stop believing before checking." At 2 in the morning, looking at the dark bedroom ceiling, she thought that maybe he was right, and that maybe it was time to check. The next morning she woke up early, before the alarm, with that specific clarity that appears after a night of intense processing. She took the notebook Patricia had given her, opened it to the first page and began to write the numbers, the scholarship, the financing, what would be left of the reduced salary after fixed bills, how long it would take to complete the evening degree while keeping the daytime job. The calculations were not generous, but they were possible. There was an important difference between the two. She folded the sheet with the numbers, put it inside the notebook and put it in her backpack. Then she made coffee, woke Veronica for work, and left for her shift with the new sneakers on her feet and something different in her posture, something her cousin noticed but wisely didn't comment on, just smiled at her cup of coffee before drinking. There was a resolution made, albeit a silent one, and silent resolutions, Claudia knew, were always the firmest. What she still didn't know was that on that same day, in the Faria Lima office, Eduardo Cavalcanti was facing a situation that would put to the test not the generosity he had demonstrated so far, but something more fundamental, the consistency between what he said and what he was willing to face when the cost became real. Isabella had requested an urgent meeting, and by the tone of the message, it wasn't about company business. Isabella Vasconcelos arrived at the Faria Lima office at 11 in the morning with the precise punctuality of someone who had scheduled the time and counted the minutes. Eduardo received her in the small meeting room, the one facing the window with a view of the avenue, not in the main room with the panel and leather chairs he used for heavy meetings. It was a choice she noticed and didn't comment on. She sat down, crossed her hands on the table and said, "I know there is someone." Eduardo didn't confirm or deny immediately. He looked at her with the calmness of someone who had learned, after 6 years of marriage and 4 of separation, that haste in answering rarely helped. Isabella continued, "I'm not here to complicate things. I'm here because I care about the company and because I care about you, and because there are rumors circulating among investors that I need you to know." He said, "What kind of rumors?" She said, "That you are getting involved with an employee of a hospital in the partner network, and that this could be interpreted as a conflict of interest depending on how the relationship develops." Eduardo was silent for a second. Then he said, "She is not an employee of any company in our network. She works at a hospital that has a contract with one of our plans like any other accredited establishment. There is no subordination relationship. There is no direct contract. There is no conflict." Isabella said, "I know that. The investors might not make that distinction." He said, "Then I will explain the distinction." She looked at him for a moment with that expression he had learned to recognize over the years, the expression of someone evaluating if the conversation still had anywhere to go. Then she said, "Loa, are you okay?" And there was something in that question different from everything she had said before. It wasn't the commercial director speaking. It was her, Isabella, the woman who had shared 6 years of life with him, and who, despite everything that had worn down between them, still carried a version of him in her effective memory that the corporate Eduardo didn't reach. He said, "I am. For the first time in quite a while, I am." She nodded with a slowness that wasn't sadness, it was recognition. She said, "Then all right. I just wanted you to know about the rumors before hearing them another way." She stood up, grabbed her purse, and left with the dignity of someone who had done what they came to do, without asking for anything in return. Eduardo stayed looking at the empty chair for a few minutes before returning to work. That afternoon, he sent a message to Claudia. "I need to tell you something. Can it be tomorrow?" She replied, "It can." The meeting was in a discreet cafe near Tatuapé on a Saturday morning, with the city still in the slow rhythm of the weekend. Eduardo told her about the conversation with Isabella without omitting anything, including the content of the rumors and the way he had responded. Claudia listened without interrupting, with her hands on her coffee cup, her gaze fixed on the table. When he finished, she was silent for a moment and said, "You know this could continue generating pressure." He said, "I know." She said, "And you are okay with that?" He said, "I am. The question is if you are." And then it was she who remained in silence for longer than was comfortable. It had reached the point she had avoided from the beginning, the point where her position needed to be declared in some way, where the space between the two needed a definition she had postponed, because defining was committing and committing was risking in a way she was still learning to authorize. She said, "I'm afraid, not of you specifically, of the size of the difference between the two worlds." He said, "I am also afraid. On my side, the fear is different, but it exists." She said, "What are you afraid of?" He said, "Of not being able to give you what you deserve without it looking like I'm buying something, and of you leaving before I can prove that isn't it." Claudia looked at him for a long moment. There was an honesty in that which disarmed her completely, because it wasn't the performative honesty of someone who knows the truth is a good strategy. It was the uncomfortable honesty of someone who was also in a terrain they didn't control. She said, "The scholarship, I decided I'm going to try." He said, "I'm happy." She said, "On my own, with the Foundation's scholarship, without depending on anything else." He said, "I know, and I didn't expect anything else." There was a pause, then she said, "Loa, but I want you to know that it's not just the scholarship, it's everything. The messages, the park, the ridiculous sneakers that made me cry alone in my room without understanding why. It's all of that together." Eduardo didn't say anything for a second. Then he said, "I know." And it was in that moment, in that simple cafe with ordinary coffee at a Formica table in Tatuapé, that something that had started in a mistaken leather seat finally found the firm ground the two had been testing for weeks. But the twist hadn't arrived yet. It arrived 2 hours later, when Claudia was walking home, and the phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. It was the Human Resources Director of Hospital Renassa. The hospital had undergone an internal audit. The restructuring of the 4th floor had been reviewed by the board after a formal contestation presented by Claudia's own supervisor, who had forwarded a letter arguing that the reduction of the load on the most qualified technicians compromised patient safety. The HR director was calling to inform her that Claudia's schedule would be maintained in its original format. The 2 shifts were back. Claudia stood still on the sidewalk for a moment, with the sun hitting her face and the noise of the neighborhood around her. It hadn't been Eduardo. It hadn't been his network of contacts, nor a discreet call to someone on the hospital board. It had been the supervisor, a woman in her 50s who had worked 30 years in the public system before migrating to the private one, who had seen Claudia work for 4 years and had decided, on her own and in writing, that that wasn't right. Claudia thanked her, hung up and stood on the sidewalk for a while longer. There was something very important in that the first big turn of the situation had come from within her own world, from the solidarity of another woman who had recognized the value of her work without needing any external mediation. She sent a message to Eduardo telling him. He replied, "Your supervisor is right, and you are too." She smiled at her phone on the sidewalk, with the sun on her face, and then put the device in her pocket and continued walking. There was still a lot ahead. The scholarship application, the documents, the adjustment of the routine, the nights of study after shifts. It wouldn't be easy. But there was a huge difference between difficult and impossible, and she had finally decided to stop treating the two as synonyms. The scholarship application was delivered on a Monday afternoon, 3 weeks after the meeting with Patricia Leão. Claudia went in person to the headquarters of the Fundação Horizonte Saúde with the folder of documents she had organized over several days. Professional history, semi-annual evaluations, proof of income, a letter of intent that she had rewritten 4 times until reaching a version that sounded like herself and not like someone trying to sound like someone who deserves a scholarship. Patricia received the folder, leafed through it briefly, said the process would take 3 weeks for evaluation and that she would receive a response in writing. Claudia left the building, walked down the sidewalk, stopped at the corner, and stood for a moment with the sun hitting the back of her neck. She had done the part that depended on her. The rest was waiting, and waiting was one of the things she had learned to do without letting the wait consume energy that would be better applied to continuing to function. She continued functioning. The shifts, the apartment, the messages with Eduardo that had taken on their own natural rhythm, with the normal ups and downs of 2 people who work a lot and are sometimes tired and sometimes have nothing important to say, but send a message anyway because absence also communicates. They saw each other 3 more times in those weeks. A quick lunch near the hospital, a Sunday afternoon at a museum on Paulista Avenue that Eduardo had mentioned casually, and that ended up lasting 4 hours because the exhibitions were good and the conversation was better. And once, without any planning, a meeting at the Tatuapé supermarket where he had stopped to buy water on an afternoon when he was passing through the region for a technical visit, and she had gone in to get dinner, and the two had stood for 30 minutes in the aisle between the pasta shelves talking, while Claudia's cart accumulated items and Eduardo's continued with only the water bottle. This meeting had been the most revealing of all, without any sophistication or planned setting. It was the Eduardo of the supermarket, in dress pants and an open shirt, holding a bottle of mineral water and discussing with her whether canned tomato sauce was really inferior to the one in glass, with the seriousness of someone who considers that a legitimate question. And there was something in that Eduardo that she had kept with more care than all the others, because it was the most like a real daily life. The Foundation's response arrived on a Thursday at 6:23 in the evening in an email she opened standing in the hospital corridor after the end of her shift, with her phone in one hand and her backpack in the other. She read the first line, then reread it, then stood still looking at the screen without moving for a few seconds. The scholarship had been approved. 80% of the tuition for the entire period of the nursing degree course starting the following semester, with the complementary financing approved under special conditions for professionals already working in the field. She went to the corridor bathroom, locked the door, sat on the closed toilet lid, and stayed in silence for a time she didn't know how to measure. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stayed quiet with the phone on her lap, and her breathing deeper than normal, processing the size of what had arrived with those few lines. 4 years of having put that dream on a shelf too high to reach without a ladder, convincing herself that it wasn't the time, that there were other priorities, that people like her reached a certain point and learned to be grateful for it. And now, here was the ladder. She sent a message to Veronica first, then to Eduardo. Veronica replied with 5 exclamation points and a sequence of emojis that filled the screen. Eduardo replied in one line, but it was the right line. "I knew you were going to pass." That night there was a dinner in the small Tatuapé apartment, Claudia and Veronica, with the food the two had learned to make with what was in the fridge, sitting at the kitchen table with the window open to the street. Veronica opened a bottle of cheap sparkling wine she had kept for an occasion, without knowing which occasion it would be, and the two toasted without a speech, just looking at each other with the kind of complicity that only exists between people who grew up together and saw how much each had carried along the way. Claudia slept well that night, deeply without waking up in the middle, without the ceiling weighing on her eyes, the type of sleep that appears when the body feels that it can, finally, let go of some of the weight. The revelation that neither of them had planned happened a week later, at a lunch where Eduardo had said he wanted to tell her something. He said it with his usual calm voice, looking at her without looking away. "When I made the presentation to Patricia, I didn't know the scholarship was going to be approved. I knew the chances were good because you have a solid history. But I didn't touch anything. I didn't call anyone. I didn't ask for different treatment. I just opened the door. What was on the other side was yours." She said, "I know." He said, "I want you to be sure of that. Because what happens from here needs to be built on what you are capable of doing, not on what I can provide." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said something she hadn't planned to say, which came from a deeper place than the arguments she had mentally prepared for that conversation. "The Eduardo I need is the one from the supermarket discussing tomato sauce. If that one exists, I'm staying." He was silent for a second. Then he said, "That one exists. It's the only one that truly exists." And there was in that a simplicity that closed months of mutual care, of advance and retreat, of two worlds that had resisted distance not because someone had erased the differences, but because the two had decided, each in their own way and time, that the distance was not greater than the will to cross it. Outside the café, São Paulo continued in its indifferent and immense rhythm. Inside, two people who had reached that table by completely different paths had finally reached the same place. Claudia paid for her own coffee. Eduardo didn't protest, because he had learned when to protest and when to recognize. They went out together along the busy sidewalk, walked a block side by side without haste, and at some point along the way, he ran his hand over hers naturally without announcing it, and she didn't pull away. There was in that small gesture the sum of everything that had preceded it: the night in the car, the linen jacket, the nursing sneakers, the coffees and the parks and the supermarket and the fears said out loud at a Formica table. It was the beginning of something neither of them would know how to name completely for some time yet, and maybe that was exactly what made it real. That afternoon, Claudia returned home, opened the notebook she had received from Patricia at the first meeting, turned to the sheet with the numbers she had calculated on that morning of insomnia, and reread everything once. The calculations remained possible. They had become a bit looser now that the two shifts had been restored. It wasn't comfortable, but it was viable, and viable was enough to start. She turned the page and wrote on the next one, in a firm hand, "First semester." Then she turned one more and wrote, "What I want to be when I grow up." And she smiled to herself, because she was 31 years old and was still discovering the answer, and there was something curiously comforting in realizing that this was completely normal. 6 months later, the 4th floor of Hospital Renassa had a new dynamic that most of the employees had noticed without necessarily being able to identify what had changed. Claudia remained the same in procedures, in care, in the precision with which she treated each patient regardless of the bed or the health plan, but there was something different in the way she moved through the corridors, a lightness that wasn't detachment from tiredness, because the tiredness still existed. It was just that it had stopped being the whole story. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, she left her shift at 6 in the evening, took the subway to Villa Clementino, and entered the amphitheater of the nursing school with the worn blue backpack she still hadn't replaced because it had even more history than when she had started. She usually sat in the 3rd row by the window, took out her notebook, and listened with an attention that the professors noticed, and that had the curious effect of making the students around her also pay more attention. There was something contagious about someone who studies because they truly want to, not because they need to complete a stage. In the weeks when the shifts coincided and she arrived later, there was always a colleague who left the notes separate. Quick and solid bonds had formed, the kind built when the people around you have equally dense and equally serious stories about what they are doing there. Eduardo appeared on Fridays when she didn't have class, which wasn't always. They had reached a rhythm that fit into both their lives without deforming either of them, which had been the most delicate part to build, and also the most important. He had learned that she needed space to study, without needing to manage someone's presence at the same time. She had learned that he had weeks where work consumed everything, and that this wasn't rejection. It was just the real texture of a life that had been built with much effort, and that continued demanding attention. Isabella Vasconcelos remained on the board of Cavalcanti Saúde, as she always had been, with the professionalism of someone who clearly separated what belonged to the personal past from what belonged to the professional present. She and Claudia never officially met, but one afternoon when Claudia stopped by the Faria Lima office to drop off a document, Isabella was leaving a meeting in the corridor, and the two crossed paths for a second. There was a brief, neutral nod, the kind that recognizes without needing to define. Claudia kept walking. Isabella did too. The world hadn't become simple. The differences between the two worlds continued to exist, because differences don't disappear when two people decide not to let them be the reason not to try. What had changed was the way Claudia saw them, not as walls, but as contexts that needed conversation, patience, and sometimes humor. There was a dinner at a fine restaurant in Jardins, where she had arrived with her uniform still in her backpack, straight from her shift, and had spent the first 10 minutes visibly out of place among the white tablecloth tables and the waiters in vests. Eduardo had noticed and asked for a cheese bread off the menu with such solemn seriousness that the waiter had gone to check if there was a way to improvise in the kitchen, and the absurd seriousness of the request had made Claudia laugh in a way that had completely broken the discomfort. There was no cheese bread, but it had become a reference between the two, invoked in situations where one world collided with the other in an uncomfortable way. Veronica had managed a promotion at the logistics company and was thinking of taking a technical management course. Gerson, the stretcher-bearer, had bought a new car and announced in the work group that the back door no longer unlocked from the outside for anyone, which had made Claudia laugh alone in the corridor without being able to explain to anyone why. The night of the wrong car had transformed into a story that the two told in slightly different ways as time passed, each emphasizing the part that seemed most absurd from their own perspective. She emphasized the leather of the seat and the expensive perfume she didn't process in time. He emphasized her expression upon waking and her hands on the backpack as if it were a medieval knight's shield. The story had gained the quality of stories that survive because they contain within them a core of truth that humor does not dissolve, only makes more portable. On one of those Fridays, sitting in a simple restaurant in Tatuapé that had somehow become their place, Eduardo said something that Claudia had kept in the same way she had kept all the other things he said when he wasn't trying to sound good, just being honest. I entered that car knowing it was wrong, that there was a woman sleeping who shouldn't be there, and I did the strangest thing I've ever done in my life, which was to sit in silence and wait. To this day, I can't quite explain why. Claudia said, "I know why." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Because you were also exhausted, just in a different way." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe." She said, "It's not maybe." And there was in that simple conversation, in that simple restaurant, the same weight that was in all the other things the two had said along the way, the honesty of two people who had reached the same place by completely different paths and who had found at the point of arrival something neither of them had planned but that both recognized when it arrived as something that was worth the cost of building. São Paulo continued immense and indifferent and impossible and real outside, and inside that restaurant, with the city making its constant noise through the window, Claudia Mendes took the last sip of coffee, put the cup on the small table, and for once she wasn't just surviving. She was living. End of story. And you who followed Claudia from that dawn in the wrong car until this moment, know that stories like this exist because the people who live them have the courage not to give up before checking. If this story touched something inside you, leave your like, because it tells us that it's worth continuing to bring narratives that respect the complexity of those who listen. Subscribe to the channel, because every week there is a new story waiting for you, and the comments are the place where this conversation continues. Tell us what you felt, what hit you deepest, what you would take from this story. We read everything. We are here, on the same side as you.